My mother smiled like a woman, handing out party favors when she gave my younger brother the keys to a fully renovated lakefront cabin in Vermont. Then she turned to me, her only daughter, and slid a curling, water-damaged envelope across the kitchen table. Inside was a deed to 40 acres of dead orchard land in upstate New York, along with a tax bill for $43,000. She told me I had until the end of the month to pay it off, or she'd make sure I never set foot in this house again. My sister-in-law didn't even try to hide her smirk. I picked up the envelope, folded it once, and told my mother thank you. What none of them understood was that the orchard sitting under their contempt was about to be worth more than every property my brother would ever own combined, and the lakefront cabin she was so proud of was about to become the thing that destroyed him. My name is Cassandra, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a split-level house outside Albany where the carpet never quite matched the curtains, and my mother Linda treated every Sunday dinner like an audition for a life she thought she deserved. My father had passed away 3 years earlier from a heart attack that nobody saw coming, and ever since then my mother had been the sole trustee of what remained of his estate. That Sunday was supposed to be about settling the last of it. The lasagna was getting cold while my brother Derek sat across from me, 28 years old, wearing a flannel shirt that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, talking about his consulting business that mostly seemed to involve posting gym selfies and borrowing money from our mother. Next to him sat his wife Whitney, a former cheer coach who had developed a very specific talent for saying cruel things in the gentlest possible voice. My mother tapped her wine glass with a butter knife to get our attention, the way she always did when she wanted an audience. She pulled a manila folder from her oversized purse and slid it toward Derek first. She announced, with her chin tilted up like she was presenting an award, that Derek was receiving the cabin on Lake George that my father had bought back in the 90s, fully paid off, water access, a dock, the whole thing. She said a man building his future needed a place to bring clients and make an impression. Derek grinned and high-fived Whitney under the table like they'd just won something. Then my mother's eyes landed on me and the warmth drained out of her face the way it always did. I worked as a soil conservationist for the county, a job my mother had never once described accurately to her friends. She usually told people I did something with plants, in the same tone she'd used to describe a parking ticket. She reached into her purse again and pulled out the water-stained envelope, the one that had clearly been sitting in a drawer for years. She dropped it on the table next to my plate, hard enough to make the silverware jump. Inside were back tax notices and a deed to a 40-acre orchard out near the Finger Lakes that my father had bought before I was born, and that hadn't produced a single viable harvest in over a decade. The photos clipped to the paperwork showed skeletal apple trees, collapsed fencing, and fields gone completely to thistle. Whitney let out this little laugh behind her wine glass, the kind designed to be heard. She said it was actually kind of poetic, considering how much I loved getting my hands dirty, and that maybe I'd finally found my calling out there with the weeds. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my face still. I asked my mother flat out what this was supposed to mean. She told me it meant exactly what it looked like, that land had been bleeding her dry in property taxes since my father died. There was a $43,000 bill attached to it, and she was transferring the whole mess into my name today. I asked her if she was seriously giving my brother a paid-off lake house while handing me a dead orchard with a debt strapped to it like a bomb. She didn't even blink. She said Derek had built something for himself while I'd spent my 20s playing in the dirt for the county, and that if I didn't sign the transfer papers right then, I could consider myself cut out of whatever was left of the family for good. No holidays, no calls, nothing. Derek laughed and told me to just sign it and stop being so dramatic, that I should be grateful I was getting anything at all. They sat there waiting for me to cry, the way they always had since we were kids, waiting for me to fold so they could feel like they'd won something. But I wasn't 19 anymore, sitting in this kitchen begging for a scrap of approval. I looked down at the deed. I read the parcel number, the name of the holding company my father had registered it under, and something in my chest went very still and very quiet because I recognized that name. I'd seen it before, in a county environmental file I'd pulled for an unrelated case 6 months earlier, back when my father's estate was still being sorted out and I'd gone digging out of nothing but curiosity. I knew something about that orchard that none of them did. I reached into my bag, took out my pen, looked at Whitney's smug little face, looked at Derek admiring himself in his phone camera, and looked at my mother's victorious expression. I smiled and told her thank you, that this was honestly exactly what I wanted. I signed my name on the transfer, becoming the sole legal owner of 40 acres of dead orchard and a debt nobody else wanted. I folded my napkin, stood up, dropped $60 on the table for my share of dinner, and told them to enjoy the rest of their evening. I walked out into the cold Albany night while they sat there confused, probably congratulating themselves on getting rid of their problem. I had exactly 28 days to pay that tax bill. I already had the money. What they didn't know was that I'd been saving for years, and that dead orchard was about to become the best thing that ever happened to me, and the worst thing that ever happened to Derek. The drive out to the orchard took just under 3 hours, and I kept the radio off the whole way, watching the highway lights blur past while I replayed my mother's face when I signed those papers. She thought she'd just handed me a punishment. She thought my degree in environmental science was a hobby, something cute I did instead of getting a real career like Derek's imaginary consulting empire. But that degree gave me access to databases and registries she couldn't even pronounce, let alone navigate. I pulled off the county road just as the sun was coming up, the pavement turning to gravel, my headlights catching the rusted gate at the orchard's entrance. I stepped out into the cold morning air and the smell hit me immediately, not just rot and dead leaves, but something sharper underneath it, something chemical. As a soil scientist, I'd spent years learning to read land the way other people read faces. I walked the tree line and saw exactly what I expected to see. The ground near the old equipment shed was dead in a way that had nothing to do with neglect. The soil there had a strange grayish tint, the kind that comes from something seeping into it for a very long time. I went back to my car, pulled out my laptop, connected to my hotspot, and logged into the State Department of Environmental Conservation's public database. I cross-referenced the parcel ID from the folder my mother had given me. My stomach dropped. There were multiple flagged violations tied to the holding company that now belonged to me. The state had been investigating this exact property for almost 4 years over illegal dumping from an old pesticide manufacturing operation that had apparently used part of the land decades ago without proper permits. At the bottom of the file was a pending fine, $1.2 million, with the clock running on a deadline to either remediate the site or face it personally as the legal owner. I sat there in my car with the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the screen, and I understood. My mother had been the executor of my father's estate. She would have received every single one of those notices. She knew exactly what she was handing me. She didn't just give me her least favorite asset. She handed me a federal-adjacent environmental liability with her own name nowhere near it anymore, and she did it smiling, in front of the whole family so Derek could walk away clean with a paid-off lake house. I let myself cry exactly once, sitting alone on that gravel road at sunrise, one long, ugly cry that felt like it had been waiting 15 years to come out. Then I wiped my face and something in me went cold and very, very clear. They thought I was the soft one. The one who'd quietly absorb whatever was handed to her because that's what I'd always done. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I opened my laptop again and pulled up the county GIS map. I traced the boundary of my dead orchard and followed it east to the next parcel over. 60 acres of untouched hillside with a natural spring running through it, currently listed for private sale through an estate auction. I checked zoning. I checked soil composition reports from a state survey 2 years back. The land had ideal drainage, ideal elevation, ideal everything for what I'd spent years quietly dreaming about but never had the capital or the reason to chase. My mother had given me 28 days to pay the back taxes and keep the LLC active, so I was going to pay them. I was going to keep that toxic little company alive and breathing exactly as it was, sitting there in the dark while I built something real right next door. The next morning, I walked into the county treasurer's office and paid the $43,000 bill in full with a cashier's check. The clerk gave me a look like I'd lost my mind, paying that much to keep a condemned orchard on the books. I just smiled and tucked the receipt into my bag. Keeping that company active was step one. As long as the taxes stayed current, my mother and Derek would assume I was quietly drowning under the weight of what they'd given me. They'd think I was trapped, exactly like they wanted. My real business that day was the parcel next door. I'd been saving for almost a decade, taking freelance soil consulting jobs on the side, living in a one-bedroom apartment well below what I could afford, never once telling my family how much I'd actually put away because some instinct in me had always known better than to let them know what I had. I registered a brand new LLC under a name that had nothing to do with mine, using a registered agent in Delaware so there was no way to trace it back to me through a casual search. I placed a cash bid on the 60 acres that closed the deal within the week before anyone else even saw the listing. By the following Friday, that hillside belonged to me. I drove out to walk the property line. To the west sat the rotting, contaminated mess my mother had handed me like a punishment. I had a local contractor reinforce the old fencing and put fresh padlocks on the gate, just enough to make it look like a broke woman trying to keep trespassers off a worthless piece of land. I left the dead trees standing. I left the chemical staining exactly where it was. I let it rot in plain sight, a monument to exactly what they thought of me. To the east was my future. The soil was rich, the spring ran clean and cold even in late summer, and the elevation gave it natural protection from frost that made it almost perfect for what I had in mind. My background wasn't just a piece of paper my mother liked to wave off as playing in dirt. It was the blueprint. I started small, bringing in heritage breed sheep known for an extremely specific, extremely high-value wool used by boutique textile mills on the East Coast. The kind of wool that sold for absurd prices per pound to designers who cared more about provenance than anything else. I built the flock slowly, hired a single shepherd I trusted completely, and spent my weekends out there in old boots and a canvas jacket doing work that made my hands ache in a way that felt, for the first time in my life, entirely mine. Within a year, word had spread through the right small circles. A textile cooperative out of Brooklyn signed an exclusive sourcing contract with me. Then a sustainable fashion label out of Portland, Maine wanted in too. I wasn't getting rich overnight, but I was building something that compounded, something with roots, something nobody could walk into a kitchen and slide across a table to take away from me. Derek, meanwhile, was busy proving exactly what kind of man he was. About 8 months after that dinner, he showed up at my apartment door, unannounced, with Whitney standing behind him, both of them smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. He said he'd heard from a guy at the county that I'd bought land out near my orchard, and wasn't that a coincidence, and didn't I want to keep it in the family, and maybe I should let him manage the consulting side of whatever I was building since he had real business experience. I almost laughed in his face. I told him I appreciated the offer, but I had it handled. He pushed harder than I expected, mentioning that he and Whitney were having some temporary cash flow issues with the cabin's upkeep, the property taxes on lakefront in New York being what they were, and maybe a small loan between siblings wouldn't hurt. I told him no. He left angry, muttering something about how I'd always been the selfish one. 6 weeks later, my mother called me directly for the first time since that dinner. She didn't ask how I was doing. She launched straight into how Derek needed cash wired to him by the end of the week to cover the cabin's tax bill and some business venture he was, apparently, this close to closing, and how it was my responsibility as a daughter who clearly had money now to help save the family's reputation. I asked her, very calmly, where exactly my responsibility to the family had been when she handed me a contaminated orchard with a federal adjacent debt attached and told me I'd be cut off if I refused it. She didn't have an answer for that. Her voice climbed into that register I remembered from childhood, the one that always preceded the worst things she ever said to me. She called me selfish, she called me ungrateful, she said I'd always resented Derek for being the favorite, and this was just my way of finally getting petty revenge. I told her I wasn't being petty. I told her I'd simply learned finally to stop handing people the rope they'd use to hang me with later. Then I hung up. What none of them knew was that the contaminated LLC sitting on my dead orchard had an outstanding remediation deadline that was about to expire in just over a year, and under state law, the listed owner of record, me, could legally transfer the company to a new owner before that deadline without immediately triggering enforcement, as long as the new owner accepted the liability knowingly in writing. I'd had an environmental attorney confirm this for me months earlier, quietly, paying her out of pocket and telling no one. I'd been sitting on this information the entire time I watched Derek beg me for loans and my mother call to guilt me into bailing them out. About 4 months later, Derek's flannel shirt consulting business finally collapsed in on itself the way I always knew it would. He'd apparently taken out a second mortgage on the cabin to fund some cryptocurrency venture that evaporated within weeks, and the bank was breathing down his neck. He called me himself this time, his voice stripped of all its usual swagger, and asked if I had any investment opportunities he could get in on, something with land, something with real assets behind it, because he needed to show the bank he had collateral lined up fast. I told him very gently that I actually did have something. I told him about a small holding company I'd inherited that owned 40 acres upstate, fully paid current on taxes, clean paper trail, no liens. I told him if he wanted it, I'd transfer it to him outright, free of charge, as a peace offering, because I was tired of the distance between us. He didn't even ask to see the property in person. He had Whitney drive out with him exactly once, took one look at the gate from the road, didn't walk the land, and told me it looked rustic but fine, that he could flip it or develop it later. I had my attorney draw up the transfer with full and explicit disclosure language about the environmental status buried in paragraph 9. Exactly where the law required it to be, exactly where a man who'd never read past the signature line would never think to look. He signed it in front of a notary in under 10 minutes, practically congratulating himself on getting something for nothing. 3 weeks later, state environmental enforcement officers showed up at the cabin on Lake George with a notice of violation and a formal demand for remediation funds, because Derek was now, on paper, the sole owner of record of a property under active investigation with an expired compliance window. The fine had grown with interest and penalties to just under $1.8 million. Because he'd signed that document in front of a notary with full disclosure attached, there was no claim of fraud he could make against me. He'd been warned, in writing, in his own signature. I wasn't there when it happened, but Whitney live-streamed most of the meltdown without realizing half her followers would later send me screenshots. State agents went through the financial records tied to the LLC and found Derek had also been using shell transactions through the company to hide income from his failed crypto venture, which turned a civil environmental case into something with federal interest attached. He was indicted a few months later on charges related to financial fraud and environmental noncompliance. He took a plea deal that kept him out of trial, but still landed him 18 months in a minimum security federal facility and a court-ordered restitution plan that would follow him for the next decade. Whitney filed for divorce within the month. She kept her car, drained what was left of their joint checking account, and disappeared from the family group chat entirely. The bank foreclosed on the lake cabin shortly after, since Derek could no longer make payments from inside a federal facility, and the proceeds from its sale went almost entirely toward his restitution. My mother lost her mind, in the way I suppose I should have expected. She hired the most expensive attorney she could find to try to save Derek, took out a second mortgage on her own house to pay the retainer, and when that wasn't enough, she liquidated what was left of her retirement account. None of it changed the outcome. The legal fees alone left her with almost nothing. Her house went into foreclosure 8 months after Derek's sentencing. She had nowhere to go and no one left to take her in, because there was no one left who hadn't watched, year after year, exactly how she treated the daughter who'd actually shown up. She's currently in an assisted living facility outside Schenectady, the kind covered by state assistance because there's no money left for anything better. I haven't visited. I send a card at Christmas because some habits take longer to die than others, but I haven't gone to see her, and I don't think I will. As for me, the flock has tripled in size. The wool cooperative I built relationships with early on now has me supplying 3 separate boutique labels, and last spring I signed a deal with a fourth, a sustainable home goods company out of Vermont that wanted exclusive access to my spring lambing season output. I bought out the contaminated orchards remediation contract myself, finally, once I had the capital to do it properly and not as a trap, because it felt wrong to let that land sit poisoned forever just because it had once been used against me. The cleanup crews finished 18 months ago. There are apple saplings growing there now, the first real green that land has seen in over a decade, and every time I drive past it I think about how something that was handed to me as a punishment became the thing that taught me exactly how strong I actually was. I built a farmhouse on the eastern hillside 2 years ago, nothing extravagant, just good bones and big windows that let the morning light in across the kitchen table. Most Sundays now I have dinner with people who chose to be there. My shepherd, Renata's replacement after she retired last spring. No, that's not right. There's no Renata here. Just the people who've earned a seat, my business partner from the textile cooperative, my neighbor who helped me string the original fencing back when I had nothing but a pickup truck and a plan, a few women from the local conservation district who became something closer to sisters than my actual one ever was. Nobody at that table has ever once made me feel like I needed to shrink myself to be welcome in it. I used to believe that loving your family meant absorbing whatever they decided to hand you, that being the responsible one, the capable one, meant carrying every burden they were too proud or too lazy to carry themselves. It took losing what was left of my relationship with my mother and my brother to understand that real strength was never in the carrying. It was in knowing exactly when to put the weight down and walk somewhere it couldn't follow you. You cannot grow anything healthy in soil someone else has poisoned, no matter how hard you work the land. Sometimes the only way to save what's yours is to let go completely of the people who never planned on giving you anything real to begin with. I stand on my porch most evenings now and look out over the hillside, the sheep moving slow and quiet in the last light, the spring catching gold where it bends through the lower field, and I think about how certain my mother was that she was handing me nothing. Real wealth was never going to be the lake cabin or the family name or any of the things they fought so hard to protect. It was always going to be this: land that's mine, work that's honest, and a table full of people who showed up for the right reasons. My name is Cassandra, I'm 31 years old, and I built every single bit of this myself out of the one thing they thought was worthless.